Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and you're watching Red Lines. Over the past week, mainstream corporate media have launched a brand new assault against the presidential campaign of Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. Well, not entirely brand new, because it's the same script we've been hearing for over 3 years at this point. Yes, apparently Russia is out to undermine our electoral process once again. The Washington Post recently reported that U.S. intelligence officials are warning the Sanders campaign of Russia's attempts to support his candidacy. Rather than ask for evidence of the absurd accusation, Sanders had this to say when questioned about the report.
And when I say to Mr. Putin, if elected president, trust me, you are not going to be interfering in American elections.
Senator, when were you briefed on this?
I'm guessing about a month ago.
And what are you going to do now that you know this?
Well, it was not clear what role they're going to play. We were told that Russia, maybe other countries, are going to get involved in this campaign. And look, here's the message to Russia: stay out of American elections. And what they are doing, by the way, the ugly thing that they are doing, and I've seen some of their tweets and stuff, is they try to divide us up. That's what they did in 2016, and that is the ugliest thing they're doing. Is they are trying to cause chaos, they're trying to cause hatred in America. It's an ugly business, and all of us have got to say, sorry, you're not going to do this in this election. And again, as President of the United States, Mr. Putin, you will not interfere in our election.
And if this came out a month ago, how do you think it came out?
So what exactly is going on here? Well, some journalists are using the opportunity to attack alternative media, including Friends of the Grayzone. Freelance grifter Casey Michelle went so far as to tweet, quote, "So much of the idiot RT/in-the-now/other Russian propagandist crowd also claims to support Sanders." So that may well be what Intel told Sanders' campaign. Unclear what else Intel would be talking about. The tweet was an obvious reference to Rania Khalek, a journalist who writes and delivers rants for Soapbox, a segment produced by the online video outlet In the Now. Rania joined me on Red Lines to respond to these allegations and share her thoughts on the upcoming presidential election. Is Putin really ordering her to support Sanders? Is it unreasonable to expect a brokered Democratic Party convention this summer? We answer those questions and more coming right up. Rania Khalek, a host with In the Now. You do the Soapbox segment, which we all know and love. And I don't know if you were aware, but apparently it may also be what's driving this Russiagate hysteria surrounding the Sanders campaign right now. You've probably heard a lot of people online whispering about the fact that you've done videos supportive of Sanders and how that might be why so-called intelligence agencies, the intelligence community, warned the Sanders campaign that Russian bots are boosting him or are responsible for the so-called Bernie bro phenomenon. What is your response to these claims, particularly that tweet from Casey Michelle?
I actually think he might have been onto something. As much as I'm not a fan of his, he might be right, because back in 2017, there was the ODNI report about Russian interference that basically, half of it was about RT's programming, saying, that it was promoting, what was it, like radical discontent?
Radical discontent, that's what it said on our friend Abby Martin's show.
Right, weird, like Orwellian term about like a show that was just like subversive thought, giving out subversive thoughts or whatever. But I mean, I can't imagine what else they would be using, because there doesn't actually seem to be any evidentiary basis to the idea that the Russians are interfering to support Sanders. But yes, it's true. I mean, if you look at RT and its various affiliates, they do tend to be pro-Sanders, but that's because the people that work at these outlets, not necessarily because they're not getting their orders. I'm certainly not getting my orders from anybody. I personally support Sanders. And therefore that translates into the videos I make. And I'm American, not Russian. So the idea that that would be used to suggest that the Russians are propping him up is really absurd, but also really scary. Because then that means that like my programs and the stuff that RT's doing, which I guess it shouldn't be surprising, is like being monitored. and is being perceived as something that impacts the outcome of elections. Like all I'm doing is getting on video and saying what I think about the Democratic primary. Like, right. That's it.
And it did have an impact on RT America, at least. The company was forced to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act as a lobbying organization. And then we can see now that they kind of backed off from doing that alternative programming they used to do. It's now more decidedly conservative, in fact. But it's true still that RT as an international network, and certainly in the now, has a very progressive bend. So people are sitting here thinking, oh, Putin is telling Rania that he prefers Sanders in the upcoming election. I don't even believe that, first of all. I don't think Putin is up at night really worrying about who's going to win.
Well, okay, so that's another thing, though. Well, two things. First, with the issue of like the progressive voices at affiliates of RT, like that I work at, I mean, one of the reasons I work where I work is because that's one of the only places I can say the things I want to say. There's few other places I can go where I can be where there's no other places I can go where I can, like, you know, put a roof over my head and also be anti-war and do journalism the way I want. Mm-hmm. So that's first of all. But as for like whether Putin's up at night, yeah, he's probably not. But you know what? It's true. Like a lot of governments around the world, all governments around the world do watch the American elections because they care who wins. Because who wins determines the outcome for a lot of parts of the world. And, you know, most of the world probably would want a Sanders-like figure to win because he's not like a warmongering psycho. He's not as hawkish as normal candidates. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were government or people in governments like the Russian government who are like rooting for someone like Bernie Sanders or somebody they feel doesn't present a threat, like an existential threat to their country or their region. Lots of people in the Middle East watch where I live, watch the US elections kind of in fear. They're like, oh God, who's going to win? Like, who's going to bomb us next? Right. So people really shouldn't be surprised that other countries care about the outcome, because who wins the American election doesn't impact just Americans. It impacts everyone around the world because we're an extremely destructive empire.
And I do think still that, especially the Russians, who are very pragmatic in their way of dealing with international affairs and relations, and as someone who's spent time in other countries, talked to people at high levels in government, people understand in other parts of the world that there isn't really that much of a change from one administration to the next. There's a constant deep state, which really is what controls policy, and Sanders could perhaps stand up to that. But that kind of brings me to this other point that I wanted to discuss, which is how all of this began in the first place, which was about a week ago during the Democratic presidential debate in Nevada. Sanders was asked about his supporters being mean online, you know, these Bernie bros that are so cruel and telling people that they need to support single payer healthcare. I don't even know. You saw that ridiculous Bloomberg ad where he like had texts and posts from Bernie saying crazy things. And Sanders actually was asked about this, and he Russiagated himself before anybody else had really brought up this point. He suggested that it could have been Russia trying to divide us once again, as they did in 2016, and using his campaign to do so. I thought that was really bizarre.
All of us remember 2016. And what we remember is efforts by Russians and others to try to interfere in our election and divide us up. I'm not saying that's happening, but it would not shock me. I saw some of those tweets.
Well, I thought it was really bizarre, and it initially didn't make sense to me what he'd said. Like, I didn't really understand it right. I was like, why did he just suddenly bring up Russian bots? Like, it was before the Washington Post story came out, like you said, and he mentioned it, like, talking about his supporters. He was like, the Russian, some of the mean people might actually just be Russian bots and not my supporters. And that was like insane to say. And then in retrospect, it makes more sense because of what he'd been told. But also, like, he's just giving and feeding ammunition to his enemies by saying himself that, oh, some of the people who are supporting me on the internet might be Russian bots. You're right. He's Russiagating himself. And I think this speaks to a larger issue of the fact that, for the past 3 years that we've been dealing with Russiagate hysteria, Bernie Sanders has time and again validated it. I mean, it hasn't been his number one concern. It hasn't been something he talks about every day like all the other people on Capitol Hill, but it is something he has regularly validated, and he's kind of taken he's allowed himself to be like boxed in to taking this like anti-Russia, sometimes hawkish stance, just to prove that he's not like soft on Russia. But ultimately, he's just hurting himself, because we always knew, as your colleague Max Blumenthal has repeatedly warned, as Aaron Mate has repeatedly warned, as I've repeatedly warned, we've all repeatedly warned, that Russiagate was ultimately going to be weaponized against the left. And that's what we're seeing happen now. And by Sanders' campaign and his surrogates repeatedly validating this, they're ultimately setting the stage for a playbook that's being used as we speak to hurt them. Whether it will work to hurt them, I don't know. But I also want to speak to something else you said, because you were talking about, traveling to other countries and people not really, caring so much like who wins, because it stays the same because of the national security state. And that's absolutely true. And it kind of makes me think, something that my friends in Lebanon tell me is, they laugh at me. They're like, oh, you think Bernie Sanders is really going to win? Like, don't you see what your country does to leaders like him in other countries? They stop them from winning. They overthrow them. They sabotage them. That's what they're going to do to him. They're not going to let him win. And when they say that, I get kind of annoyed, but also I feel like they're a little bit right. That this is another reason why Sanders supporters need to be more vigilant about, hitting back against the Russiagate playbook, because that's a part of the national security state trying to sabotage him. It's just one of the many tools that they're going to use to try and sabotage him the way they do leaders in the global South who have similar politics to him.
Especially if he actually did win. Look at the last 4 years of the Trump presidency. Every step of the way, the Democrats actually tried to paralyze him and eventually remove him from office, conducted a impeachment show trial based on Russiagate. And it was designed to not only try and remove him from office, but just make it so that no one was actually talking about real issues in the media and on Capitol Hill. Imagine if Sanders were actually president, I could see them doing the exact same thing to him, which is why when I hear people make the argument, oh, Sanders needs to virtue signal to the Russiagators because he needs to win over the MSNBC crowd, I don't really believe the MSNBC crowd exists as an actual tangible voting bloc in this country. I think most people, especially people who are potential Trump voters who could be turned over to Sanders, would much rather hear him reject this narrative and say, I don't think the US public wants to hear anything more about Russia undermining our democracy, when we have the Democratic Party building an app literally called Shadow and obscuring the results of the Iowa caucus. Who needs Russia when they're doing that to my campaign? I mean, imagine if Sanders said these things and really adopted a Trumpian way of responding to these attacks. I think it would actually be helpful for him in terms of winning votes.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the fact that Donald Trump did so well and won proves that, because Donald Trump didn't make those points in such a smart way, but he was kind of making similar points at the establishment. If Bernie Sanders actually went with that and did it against the DNC, I actually think it would benefit him tremendously. Yeah, and his tweets are going viral. And I think you're 100% right. It's MSNBC is a bunch of millionaires. It's a bunch of elite millionaire pundits who work on behalf of oligarchs, American billionaires, to try and justify the insane inequality we have in the country and the status quo. That's their job. Their job is to hate Bernie Sanders because of everything he stands for. Winning them over isn't going to help him. In fact, MSNBC has been so insanely negative towards Bernie Sanders, and it hasn't affected his poll numbers one bit. So I don't think he needs to be trying to pander to that crowd at all. He needs to do the opposite, because the country hates that crowd, as was demonstrated by the election of Donald Trump.
Working people, average voters, don't want to hear this Russia hysteria. And the people at MSNBC who buy it are either Democrats who are going to vote for the Democrat no matter who they are against Trump, so he doesn't really need to care about them for the moment, or they're people who are such an entrenched part of the elite class that they actually would prefer 4 years of Trump to 4 years of Sanders. In fact, you already had Chris Matthews this past weekend not only comparing Sanders winning Nevada to Hitler invading France, taking territory in France, but also saying, look, maybe if Sanders is going to be the candidate, we should just sit back for 4 years and get things together as a party. And I think they would love to be a permanent opposition party to Trump for 4 years and actually just engage in theater politics instead of delivering a progressive agenda or openly fighting a candidate or a president such as Sanders.
I'm wondering whether the Democratic moderates want Bernie Sanders to be president. I mean, that's maybe too exciting a question to raise. They don't like Trump at all. Do they want Bernie Sanders to take over the Democratic Party in perpetuity? Well, I mean, he takes it over. He sets the direction for the future of the party. Maybe they'd rather wait 4 years and put in a Democrat that they like.
You also hear people now not only baiting him on Russia, but over the last few days, Rania, it's been focused on comments that Sanders made decades ago about the leaders of Nicaragua, still the leader of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, or the Cuban revolutionary leader, Fidel Castro. You have Pete Buttigieg jumping on the stage last night during a town hall and saying, we don't need a Democratic Party that has to explain why Fidel Castro is good.
I don't want, as a Democrat, I don't want to be explaining why our nominee is encouraging people to look on the bright side of the Castro regime when we're going into the election of our lives.
What do you make of all of this drama and the Sanders response to it?
So obviously he's just being red baited, and with the comments he made about Nicaragua and Cuba in the past, this isn't the first time he's been confronted with it. They always try to do this with him, because it's like an easy way for them to attack him. I think to pander to the Florida crowd of Cuban former plantation owning exiles who are all right wing and going to vote for Trump anyway. And I also think it's a way for them to demonize social programs. That seems to be a big issue here. I mean, they'll have the last couple of days being spent talking about, oh my God, Sanders spoke kindly of Fidel Castro's massive literacy program. That's so disgusting. Massive literacy programs for poor people are really bad.
That's authoritarianism. Only authoritarian leaders want their public to read.
Yeah, or it's insane too. Just the whole rhetoric around it's kind of funny to me because they talk about, Castro took away all these freedoms, and it's like Castro helped overthrow a dictatorship. He didn't take away freedoms. There weren't freedoms in Cuba to be taken away. It was uncontrolled.
That's actually what Chris Cuomo said last night when questioning Sanders.
So when Fidel Castro first came to power, which was when? 59? Does that sound right?
59-60.
Okay. You know what he did? He initiated a major literacy program. There was a lot of folks in Cuba at that point who were illiterate. And he formed the literacy brigade. You may read that. He went out and they helped people learn to read and write. You know what? I think teaching people to read and write is a good thing. I have been extremely consistent and critical of all authoritarian regimes all over the world, including Cuba, including Nicaragua, including Saudi Arabia, including China, including Russia. I happen to believe in democracy, not authoritarianism.
To the Democrats who say, you don't say good things about Fidel Castro. He destroyed freedoms in that country. He picked winners and losers and killed them and put them in prison forever. You don't give him a pat on the back for anything.
Yep.
Yeah, he was like, but how do you, what do you say to people who are like, how can you say this? Fidel Castro took away freedoms. Fidel Castro helped overthrow, with a revolution behind him, a U.S.-backed military dictatorship that had public executions. The only freedoms Fidel Castro took away was for the freedom of the free market of American cartels to own Cuba. That's the freedoms he took away. The whole rhetoric around it is insane. But I guess more importantly is the Sanders campaign response. I think his response is pretty strong when he mentions, well, why are you so against reading and writing? But then he goes into this thing about, authoritarianism and this axis of authoritarianism, where he starts talking about Cuba and Nicaragua and Russia and China. And he mentions all of these countries on the State Department hit list. Sometimes he'll sprinkle in Saudi Arabia, to be a little.
And we're
fairer.
supposed to be like, yay! He said Saudi Arabia.
He said Saudi Arabia, the biggest tyrant in the world, the biggest tyrannical regime in the world. But the point is I think that rhetoric is actually really dangerous. because I mean, how different? I mean, axis of authoritarianism sounds a lot to me like axis of evil, and that sort of rhetoric can easily be used and manipulated to justify this sort of like interventionist model that we have in America that never goes away no matter who's in charge. And if Sanders is this soft on this stuff during a campaign where he's just taking all of these countries that America wants to destroy and constantly, bashing them, what does that mean when he becomes president? I don't know. And I think his base should push him more on that. And I don't see a lot of that happening. I also think you said something about like them, obstructing him if he becomes president. I also think there's a lot of naivete happening about his ability to win the nomination. And I know it's something nobody wants to talk about. Like no one wants to talk about this for different reasons. Some people fear it will depress turnout. Other people are kind of in denial about it. And other people are like, oh, we'll just worry when we get there. But I think it's a discussion that needs to happen now. It's great. Like Bernie Sanders crushed everyone in Nevada, but he still it's hard to use the word only because he got so much of the vote. But, it was among a group of like 10 people running that he got 46% in Nevada. 46%. If he were to get 46% in every state he won, he still wouldn't have the threshold of pledged delegates he would need to avoid a brokered convention where super delegates could take the nomination from him. And I think it's really naive to think that the Democratic Party won't do that just because they don't want to blow up their party. Because as you just said, a lot of them would be perfectly happy spending the next 4 years being an opposition party that is nothing except for opposed to Trump, just as they've spent the last 4 years. That's their entire identity as a party.
They raise a lot of money. They get a lot of media theater, bread and circuses for people so that they don't have to. Imagine if they'd been talking about housing or healthcare, education, things people actually need during the weeks that they were spending talking about Ukraine Gate, not Joe Biden's involvement in Ukraine Gate, but Trump's. I mean, it's absurd.
Exactly. And I mean, that's why it's naive to think that the elites of this party really care that much about beating Trump. If they cared that much about beating Trump, they would all be backing Bernie Sanders because obviously he has the best chance. He has the biggest base. He has the biggest movement and enthusiasm behind him. Instead, they've been doing the exact opposite. Some of them are kind of slowly coming around to the idea of him being the nominee, but it's just some people in elite media. It's not the elites of the party. And as Kevin Gostola reported for the Grayzone about the people that were put on the DNC committees by Tom Perez, it's all Obama and Clinton people. It's all people who hate Sanders. It's all people who sit on the boards of health insurance companies. It's all people who work for USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, people who literally spend their time, trying to sabotage governments in other countries are the ones
think about doing that here.
No, they would never, because America's a democracy. I mean, it's so insanely naive to think that it won't happen. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm just being like an alarmist about it, but I don't think I am. 2016 was a little different because Hillary Clinton did ultimately, even without superdelegates, have more votes than him. But this time around, but just because that's the case, they still sabotaged him in 2016. They still sabotaged his campaign merely by like reporting superdelegates as a part of Hillary Clinton's delegate count, which depressed turnout for him. Like little things like that. They did sabotage his campaign. We know it from DNC leaks. The idea that they're not doing everything, and they're openly stating it, like they're not even hiding it. They're doing everything in their power to do that now. Bloomberg is openly talking about a brokered convention. But everybody at the Nevada debate, except for Sanders, raised their hand, or didn't raise their hand. I can't remember which way the question was, but ultimately admitted that they don't believe the person with the plurality of delegates should win. That tells me that come the convention, they're going to like totally try and take it away from him. There's a reason Elizabeth Warren is still in the race. Her base, part of her base would go to Sanders if she dropped out. She's polling so low in the single digits. She's gotten in like 4th and 5th place in every state that's gone so far.
But that's all she has to do.
Is just stay in the race, even though she's not winning, so she can collect a few delegates. I mean, and take away some of Bernie's base. I mean, they have like 5 different people running just to take away from him. And I initially didn't really understand it. I initially thought they were stupid to be running so many centrists because I knew they would be splitting the centrist vote. But like in the last month, I've come to understand that the reason they have so many different moderates running is to take voters away from Sanders so that there's no way, if it was a two-way race between Sanders and Biden or Sanders and Warren or Sanders and Bloomberg, Sanders would be getting like 60% of the vote. There would be no question about who has more delegates or the threshold for delegates. But because they have like 5 different people running against him, that's intentional. It's an effort to sabotage him so he can't reach the threshold. So like, I don't have the answer on how you deal with that. I just think it's something that should be discussed more because it's really naive to think they'll just give it to him.
I think that's precisely what needs to be done, especially from Sanders himself. After Iowa and New Hampshire, the first primary and the first caucus and the first primary of the season, Sanders won the popular vote in both states, but walked away with fewer delegates than Buttigieg or the exact same amount. I think at that point, it would have been very useful for Sanders to start talking about this openly, start to say that shows you how flawed the so-called democracy of the Democratic Party is, if I can win the popular vote and get the same amount of delegates. And he should be educating the public about what it actually will take to stand up to the superdelegates. And I honestly don't know what it is, but I think you needed to start building a mass movement. I personally, if I were him, probably would have called for my supporters in Iowa to hold demonstrations and protest and demand that they had the actual results of their caucus properly tallied. What happened there was a complete crime and assault on our electoral system. And instead, everyone was like, let's just move on and win. I don't think that's a winning strategy because they're up against, as you laid out, a system and a party that's completely rigged against them. What do they think is going to happen at the convention? I mean, you were at the 2016 convention, right? When Sanders supporters did stage some sort of resistance to what happened there, but are they imagining that they're actually going to storm the convention and that the Democratic Party is suddenly going to say, oh, you guys win, take over the party, you Bernie bros? I just don't see
all yours. Well, so let me tell you, when I was there in 2016 at the Democratic National Convention, there was a huge demonstrations outside of the convention. The problem is the convention, like a lot of conventions in the US of any sort, is like all this security theater. So there's like a mile worth of checkpoints you have to get to before you can even like enter the building. So it's actually really hard to demonstrate outside of the convention. It doesn't sound as easy as it is. You're not like right outside the building holding a picket sign. So there's that. But there was huge protests outside the convention in 2016. It didn't get that much attention except for in like alternative media. And then on the inside of the convention, there was also demonstrations. There was a massive walkout where like they actually kind of had to shut everything down for a few hours because of Bernie Sanders delegates like leaving the convention when Hillary Clinton was called the nominee. But they did such a good job with security and with delegate, like with Hillary Clinton volunteers and DNC volunteers of stage managing it, that you didn't actually notice it on TV if you were watching. And they'll do the same thing this year. Like, it's really, really, really easy, not easy, but they have like a system in place to stage manage every single minute of the inside of the convention that appears on television. And all of the major networks go with it. And when I was there, I was reporting for the Real News and for Shadowproof. And so I was like reporting on these demonstrations, and some other alternative media outlets like were doing the same thing. I know the Young Turks was doing it. I know some like online like bloggers were doing it, but that was it. Like, and Sanders supporters were tweeting about it, but like that was it. The rest of the media, MSNBC, CNN, like they can never be relied on to actually tell you what's happening. It was like another world was taking place. Hillary Clinton was being crowned the nominee, and everybody was really happy about it. So, and it was so weird to see that juxtaposition of like what we're seeing in the media and what I was seeing like inside the convention. It was so different, but it just shows you how easily they can manipulate what's taking place. So
and just ignore people. The party and the media can just ignore masses of people. And if they did it then and they've done it throughout history, what's going to stop them this year?
I don't know. And like, I mean, I go back and forth on this because I like the idea of like, yeah, like Sanders supporters will like storm the convention and we're not going to do it like 2016. Will be even harder this time. But like, I don't know if that's true. I think what would ultimately happen if the Democratic Party took the vote away is a lot of people would maybe not everybody, but a significant number of people would just kind of get in line and vote for the Democratic nominee. The people who are pissed off would be alienated from politics for the next several years, and maybe never come back to caring about electoral politics, and that would like be the end of it.
And it really is up to Sanders himself, because he's already said that he'll support the nominee, whoever it is. I don't think that's useful for him at this point. I think he should be out there saying, look, I'm the one with the base. I'm the one who has people supporting me, ready to defeat Donald Trump. I mean, why? I just don't understand why he's so weak. I think it's up to him how the movement goes, and it doesn't seem, from the way he's responding to these attacks to how he's discussing the way he'll treat the party down the line, just I would like to see a bit more force from him, and I think it would benefit him.
No, I agree to a degree. Like, I understand why he's not out and out saying, like, I won't accept the results if they take it away from me.
Right.
Because he has to be he has to, like, have some, like, be, you know, he has to be strategic about how he does that, because he hasn't won yet. But I do think I don't think he should be going around saying, like, I'm going to support whoever the nominee is, because what if it's Michael Bloomberg? Is he really going to support Michael Bloomberg?
Cross that bridge when it comes to it.
At the very least, that's what he should say. At the very least,
I plan on winning, so let's ask me that question after I win.
Yeah,
or ask
exactly.
all of yourselves that question after I win. Why can't you just say that?
Well, at this point, too, it's kind of obvious that it's his to lose. Like, no one else is polling as well as him. No one else is going to do as well as him. He's going to have a plurality of delegates. So I don't know. I don't know what it says. And I guess, like, the issue here is if this is how he is during the campaign, maybe he'll get harder and we just haven't seen it yet. But so far, if this sort of, like, softness is how he is during the campaign, like, let's say he wins and becomes president, he's going to have an obstructionist Congress, and not just an obstructionist Congress from Republicans. It'll be Democrats, too. Democrats and Republicans will, like, stand together to prevent everything he wants from happening.
That's why MSNBC is already out there campaigning actively against Medicare for All. They're saying this is a losing strategy, a losing issue, when that's what the people want.
Yeah, and that's another thing, too, is, like, sometimes I see people, I understand why people get upset with the coverage from CNN and MSNBC. I 100% understand. It's really obnoxious. It's obviously, like, complete distortion and slander of Bernie Sanders. But at the same time, those outlets are never going to be on your side, and you should expect that. Like, MSNBC and CNN are never going to be fair to Bernie Sanders. Not now, not if he becomes president, because they are run by a bunch of billionaires. And they pay a bunch of millionaires to be their pundits and Showtime hosts. Like, that's just the way it is. That Bernie Sanders stands against everything that they are for. So you're never going to get nice coverage from MSNBC. You might get, like, one pro-Bernie voice that shows up every once in a while, but that's about it. And so it's like, I don't know. I feel like there's a bigger problem taking place that people aren't taking note of. And it's great to be excited about Bernie Sanders and that he's winning and doing well. But there's these other things that if you ignore them now, you're going to, like, feel like someone pulled the rug from under you when the nomination gets stolen from him. You know what I mean?
Yeah. On the topic of MSNBC, there is something else I wanted to discuss because it's kind of personal for me and for you too, because while you didn't work at RT with me, you would sometimes come in as a guest. And so you knew Ed Schultz, someone that I had the privilege of working with at RT back in the good old days when it kind of looked like a different network. But Ed had come to RT America after his time at MSNBC had come to an end, basically not only because he was a vocal supporter of Sanders, but also because he'd been covering the Trans-Pacific Partnership and really going after the policies of the corporations which funded MSNBC. But one story Ed always told me, and the reason that I'm telling it now, Ed passed away tragically. It was shocking to all of us. I think it was in 2017, less than a year after I'd sat next to him on election night and watched President Trump win the 2016 election. But during that primary season, Ed always spoke the truth about Sanders, and he wasn't afraid to talk about what was happening when he had spent time at MSNBC. And he told me this story always. He told everyone this story of when Sanders was announcing his candidacy in 2016. for the nominee, for the Democratic nominee. Ed had the exclusive interview with him. He'd flown out to, I believe it was Iowa or somewhere. It may have even been in Vermont, actually, in his home, to film a sit-down interview with Sanders to discuss his campaign. And he was standing in live position, ready to go and introduce his interview for the 8 o'clock show, which I believe is what he hosted. And he was standing there ready to go live. And then he was told by the producers or someone in his ear, sorry, we're cutting this show. We're going to take an Obama press conference live. Forget about it. And so he had that story. He was going to be the only one covering Sanders. He had the exclusive access on the day he announced his candidacy, and MSNBC pulled the plug. And I know that Ed, if he were alive now, he would be calling out every single one of those hosts on MSNBC, from Chris Matthews to Chris Hayes, honestly, because when I sit there and I watch the way they are playing dumb, especially during the Iowa caucus and New Hampshire results, to the fact that Sanders was even then clearly the front runner and just obscuring his victories completely, I think it speaks a lot to how much those people are really just willing to sell out their souls. Maybe not someone like Chris Matthews. We don't expect much from him. But Joy Reid, Chris Hayes.
Yeah.
Joy Reid probably also believes what she says at this point. But how can you live with yourself?
I mean, especially like so that moment where Chris Matthews was like talking about Bernie Sanders winning and then comparing it and then saying, well, if the socialists had won, they would have shot me in Central Park.
I have my own views of the word socialist, and I'll be glad to share them with you in private. And they go back to the early 1950s. I have an attitude about them. I remember the Cold War. I have an attitude towards Castro. I believe if Castro and the Reds had won the Cold War, there would have been executions in Central Park, and I might have been one of the ones getting executed.
Like, have socialists ever executed people in America? Has that even happened? When he said that, it was so insane. He was implying that if Sanders wins, people are going to be publicly executed in America. That's what he was implying. It was
a little bit inflated of himself. I was thinking, Chris
Matthews,
like, you're not even that important.
Yeah.
Nobody cares.
Nobody cares. Like, he thinks he's like, yeah, he's not like some billionaire oligarch. It's like, anyways, but the point is, Chris Hayes was sitting next to him when he said that, and he kind of pushed back, but like more in like a that's ridiculous, silly, and giggled about it kind of way. But when I see that, I'm just like, dude, like, didn't you used to work for the nation? Like, it's just so bizarre to watch, but I guess that's what happens when you get paid millions of dollars a year. You're like, I mean, and Chris Hayes definitely isn't the worst, and every once in a while, he'll be fair and say something pro Sanders and push back. But like at the end of the day, that entire network is basically a bunch of liberal sellouts. And to expect MSNBC
and Rachel Maddow, who used to do these epic rants against the Republican governors of Michigan and Wisconsin when they were pushing right-to-work legislation. I remember watching her and being like, yeah, she speaks for me. And now she is like a deranged
She's like
nobody.
a mouthpiece. She's like a CIA mouthpiece now. Like, it's actually shocking. She's like a CIA, like she literally just praises the intelligence agencies on her show. It's disgusting. It's disgusting what these people have, like, which people like her have turned into. But it's like, I guess it's like Trump derangement syndrome has done that to so many people. I mean, Anya, it's to the point where like Tucker Carlson speaks more to Sanders supporters than anyone at MSNBC. How sad is that?
It's
like someone on Fox News.
He actually has monos where he says the Sanders movement is an actual movement. They are confident they're the future. That's not going to go away whether or not he wins or loses. And the ruling class are freaking out about Sanders. I was like, I'm watching primetime Fox right now.
I mean, it's no wonder like Bernie Sanders' campaign sees Fox News as nicer to them than MSNBC. That's why I guess it goes back to like, I think it's
Fox
really
called the Nevada caucuses for Sanders 2 hours before MSNBC did. Right, they were like, it's too early to call.
I mean, it's at this point, MSNBC, like, it was funny because today they announced that they're going to like hire some pro-Sanders voices. And I'm sure that means they're going to hire like the most hawkish pro-Sanders voices who they can find. like people who maybe support universal health care, but also like don't mind if we continue our wars. Because there are people like that who support Sanders. Like there are people who support Sanders specifically because of his domestic policy, and they just don't care about foreign policy.
Even though
that's
they're
a lot
entirely connected, which is what the entire campaign of Tulsi Gabbard is designed to explain. She's constantly talking about how healthcare, education, things that we need here are connected to our necessity to end endless wars, useless wars abroad.
I don't want to name any names, but like it's also been a bit frustrating to watch people, some of the most vocal Sanders supporters, defend him by attacking his opponents from the right. Yeah. I've seen that happen a couple times, like people saying things like, you're trying to use the whole authoritarianism thing to say, well, Bernie Sanders doesn't cozy up to dictators and repressive states like China, and Russia. And it's like, okay, you're attacking his opponents from the right if you say that. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not about cozying up to countries. Like, it's like that doesn't demonstrate something nefarious. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of U.S. imperialism and a complete ignorance of the connection between U.S. imperialism and the lack of all of the social programs in America that you want to take place. Yeah. Like, those things you're not going to get universal health care if you can't throw a wrench into the military industrial complex. Like, it's just not going to happen. Until people start understanding that, like, I don't know how much further we're going to get, especially if those are the most respected voices in his campaign that get all the platforms.
Yes, one of my favorite, if not my favorite, U.S. academic, Michael Parenti, he always makes the point, the empire, and this doesn't even apply necessarily only to the United States, he's also done work on Rome, but the empire always sacrifices the republic for its ambitions abroad. That the people here in many ways are the first victims, or the people in the actual republic are the first victims of empire, and then they're sacrificed. They're not given social programs so that the empire can accumulate all of its wealth in order to just keep it at the top and then exploit resources and labor people all around the world. That is the key to imperialism. So you can't connect, or you can't fail to connect domestic policy to foreign policy if you're serious about delivering anything progressive or any social programs in this country.
And exactly. And that doesn't just mean saying you oppose the Iraq War, saying you oppose America bombing countries. That also means recognizing the way the U.S. destabilizes countries and not throwing those countries under the bus, like we see happening a lot of times.
And China.
Including Russia and China, and also countries in Latin America. Like, Bernie Sanders, his base needs to push back on him calling Daniel Ortega a dictator. That's crazy. Yes. Like, calling Nicaragua a dictatorship or accusing its government of authoritarianism is insane. And unfortunately, a lot of the most prominent voices on the left at publications like Jacobin, which, I'm not completely denouncing Jacobin, but sometimes the stuff that they publish, they publish things going after Nicaragua, and I think it's insane. I think it's
people
insane
who have never been there. I read really awful reports by very prominent progressive YouTubers and whatnot who have written reports for Jacobin about countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela and never spent any time there. And they always make these throwaway comments, the authoritarian, sure, they're authoritarian. It's like, what do you know? Have you been there?
Have you been to America, by the way? Do you want to talk about authoritarianism? When you talk about Nicaragua being authoritarian, do you think America's a tyranny? Because, there's way more democracy in Nicaragua than there is in America. But even beyond that, I mean, these same people, it's the same kinds of people. There's a certain opportunism here. It's the same sorts of people who openly talk about the 1980s and the Contras and the CIA in Latin America and what they did in Nicaragua and Cuba and all these countries. And to, just to show their sort of radical cred. But then when it comes to 2020, they're the ones who are calling everybody dictator lovers.
Right.
For defending countries from CIA sabotage. It's a disconnect there.
Is also that we've, over the past few days, the Sanders campaign and his supporters have spent time defending his favorable comments about Nicaragua and Cuba from decades ago, when his more recent comments are just shameful, really. And the other thing about these people I always think is funny is that or just demonstrates their mentality is they lionize and really look up and admire people like Lula, the Brazilian president who was thrown in jail and did for a while leave pretty much a left of center progressive government in Brazil, didn't change the country structurally enough that it actually could last and hold on. And he was thrown in jail, and that was a complete, I mean, it was a coup really overseen against Dilma Rousseff by the Obama administration. And it was really criminal what happened to him. But they love looking up to people like that, people who essentially lost. Mm-hmm. But they don't ever want to defend the governments who actually have to fight to stay alive and actually do fight to stay alive and continue to give people the social programs and preserve the gains made of their revolutionary processes, such as, for example, in Venezuela.
Right, and also,
which is, how are you going to defend Sanders when he's in power? What does he going to have to do to survive?
It's also interesting too, because a lot of those same people you're talking about, and one day we'll name names, but not today. But like a lot of people you're talking about did when Lula was still in power in Brazil, that's when the criticism was happening from some of the left of the global north in the U.S. And then suddenly, once he was out of power, then they were like, oh no,
he's a hero.
And then it got. Yeah, now he's a hero because he lost, like, because he was like overthrown in a soft coup by the U.S. But no, you're absolutely right. And I think this also kind of speaks to this issue of like, I understand why Sanders does it, but it's still annoying. And I'm still allowed to say it's annoying. This kind of like constant glorifying, romanticizing Denmark. You know, while throwing like Nicaragua under the bus. It's
I mean, the
really
Scandinavian European countries, their socialism, their social progressive governments are all built on imperialism.
Yeah, and they're all built on like stolen wealth. Like
exactly.
They're all built on
looted wealth of even Europe.
Yes, exactly. And these countries also still participate in like the global imperialist economy. And yes, they have great social welfare programs, and I would love to see those kinds of programs in the US, but those programs are also under assault. And like sprinkling a couple refugees in those countries. Okay, not a couple refugees to be fair, but like throwing in some refugees in those countries, which by the way is an outcome of American imperialism, ultimately is moving those countries so far right that there's like, you know, a creeping fascism taking place in those countries where these far right parties start to win. So those countries, even though they have better social safety nets, they're kind of undergoing a lot of the same problems that you see across the West, across the global North, because of the collapse of global capitalism. So like those countries aren't immune from it. So we clearly need something better.
Because they are capitalists. They're not socialist.
Because they are. But that's the problem. That's the problem. That's why they're not immune to it, is they're still experiencing and undergoing the same sorts of issues we are, just not to the extreme degree that Americans are, but they're still having to deal with austerity.
And that's every single European country. It's not even just the Scandinavian countries, but even the UK, Spain, all of these former imperial powers, which now their publics do have more social programs than we do. Those programs are still built on their imperial legacy and the fact they're dependent on the U.S. continuing to be its global imperial power.
Exactly. They're still dependent on that, and they're still capitalist economies at the end of the day, and that's why they are still subject to the same problems that we have in America, which is like the rise of, and maybe it's not a problem, but the rise of anti-establishment politics support ending up, you know, feeding into the far right and austerity programs, and all of these things that we're dealing with. It's just not to as bad of a degree because they had more of a welfare state to begin with, but you're absolutely right. And so that's why it's like really frustrating to watch when those countries are lionized and romanticized. Denmark. Also, there's like a kind of racism in that too, because it's like only the white imperial, you know, nations get to be praised. But oh my God, the disgusting, gross brown people and black people in Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela, ew, we don't want to be like them. Like we don't want to even defend them.
Or even Syria, where they have healthcare and education, and subsidized bread.
I mean, even these same people who are going on and on, it's really great to see everybody recognizing what the CIA did in the 1980s. But can we also recognize what the CIA and the State Department and all of its many arms are doing now? Because those same people won't do that. Those same people will actually like work to undermine anti-war politics. That's why those same people hate Tulsi Gabbard.
Yes.
And those same people absolutely despise Tulsi Gabbard.
Yes, because she actually has a way more radical view when it comes to foreign policy. She's not an anti-imperialist the way many people, I guess, want to imagine a candidate should be, but she's certainly has more consistent understanding of international affairs than Sanders does. And something I appreciate about her is that generally when she's pushed about her views, not wanting to sanction Syria or going to Syria and visiting with the president, she doesn't play the game of denouncing or criticizing that government. She actually does what you should do if you're a U.S. leader, which is leave that part out of it. You don't have to make any judgment call about a foreign country. It's actually not your place. In fact, it's imperial. If you're making any call about the authoritarian governments, I'm sure she's given many statements that aren't perfect, but she by far has that message at the center of her campaign way more securely than Sanders.
She also, I think, dealt with the issue of being called a Russian asset much better than he did.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it wasn't as bad what was said about him that was said about her. But when she was attacked and called a Russian asset and called Putin's stooge, like she pushed back hard. And she didn't push back by talking about Russia. She didn't even have to go into the Russiagate stuff. She just pushed back hard, saying how offensive. Yeah, and insulting it was, and she pushed back against Hillary Clinton, and then it was really like
and the media. She attacked
and the
New York Times. People appreciate that.
And I think that it was. I'm not saying Bernie Sanders has to get up and talk about how Russiagate was a big false flag for the last 3 years, but he should at least not allow the media to frame his supporters as Russian bots.
No.
And the point I want to make, one of the last points I want to make about this is that, there's a parallel here. I think Sanders has much more popularity than Jeremy Corbyn did in the UK, and has a much better chance of winning. But that said, I think a lot of people were pointing out that
their party system is far more democratic than the Democratic parties. The Labour Party, the members actually elect the leader, not a bunch of superdelegates.
Right. It is. But I do think that Sanders has a bigger movement behind him. Maybe I should put it that way. And I think he has a better chance of winning than Corbyn actually did. However, we all watched as Corbyn's campaign was under constant, relentless attack about this, manufactured anti-Semitism crisis.
Which is coming for Sanders as well.
I actually don't think that, I think it is coming, but I don't think that will work as well on Bernie Sanders, given that he's Jewish, he's the son of Holocaust survivors, and he's not anywhere near as radical on Palestine as Jeremy Corbyn has been. So I don't think it actually, he isn't even, you can't really even attack him the way that Jeremy Corbyn has been attacked.
They'll just attack his surrogates.
Right, they will attack his surrogates, but I actually, on this issue, I don't think it'll be the anti-Semitism issue that they can make into as big of an issue as they did with Corbyn. I think it'll actually be the Russia issue. I think Russian interference and this sort of red baiting is what will work better on Bernie Sanders in the U.S. context. Maybe, I could be totally wrong, but it just seems, especially after how soft he was, I actually think Bernie Sanders is in a much stronger position in the way he pushes back on Israel-Palestine when he or his surrogates are called anti-Semites. He has stood behind Ilhan Omar. I think what he's softer on is the Russiagate stuff, is the whole authoritarian country stuff. And I think that that'll play a bigger role in trying to damage him than calling him an anti-Semite would. And at the end of the day, I don't know how much of the electorate even cares about this crap. It's just talking about it distracts from talking about the issues. So if we spend all our time talking about Russia and Cuba, we're not talking about universal health care and not going to war and student loan debt and medical debt and all of these issues that are hurting average Americans.
That's why I wished he would direct these attempts to distract the conversation. Anytime Russia is brought up, to just say, this isn't what people care about. Let me talk more about my platform and the reason why people are supporting me. Just to sort of wrap, Rania, I want to just get your take going forward. Who do you think benefits the most from these attacks on Sanders or brokered convention? I know I personally, I believe that people like us, people who spend a lot of time on Twitter or work in media, are underestimating the impact that someone like Michael Bloomberg could have on the race. I was at the gym the other night, and that's the only time that I really see cable news. In about 15 minutes, I saw 3 Michael Bloomberg ads. One of them, one of his slides said Medicare for all, and then in smaller print above it said choice of. But he was trying to make it sound like he supports Medicare for all. And honestly, more average voters, especially in these states that are not centers of political energy, more just average states in the country, in the South and the Midwest, those types of voters are watching cable news, they're watching local sports way more than they're watching a televised debate. That might be fun for us, but these people are going to see local television ads. They're going to hear ads on the radio. And Bloomberg has a lot of name recognition. He's dumped a lot of money into the race. I wouldn't rule him out taking a substantial chunk of some votes. I'm not saying he would necessarily even be the candidate, but I think he can do damage to Sanders. Where they go at the convention, at a brokered convention, I think is another question. Could be him. I think Warren also has a good chance of being the consensus candidate. What are your thoughts?
I actually agree with what you said. I initially was like, Bloomberg, nobody's going to vote for him. He's a loser. He's got no charm. But
True.
Actually, like when you see how much influence Bloomberg has been buying for like the last 15 years, this didn't just start this year. Bloomberg has been building a network of influence that he's bought for over a decade all across the country. And that influence means support. It really does mean support. And also all these ads work too. Like I've got a couple of relatives who want to vote for Bloomberg because they've seen his ads, or because a couple of them are like originally from New York and they're like, he's a New Yorker like us.
Like a lot of people think another New York billionaire is exactly what we need to go up against Trump. People will actually fall for that logic.
Oh, totally. They will. I've heard that as well. And so I think it's definitely naive to rule him out. I think, yes, he did terribly at the debate he was involved in, but you're totally right. Like we watch debates because like it's our job to.
And
we're
it's
entertained by them. Yeah, we're entertained by them. It's like watching like a wrestling match for us. Not most people don't feel that way. Most people aren't taking time out of their evening to watch the Democratic primary debate. And at the end of the day, like people do, I hate to say it, but we do have a lot of political illiteracy in America. Just like we have a lot of media illiteracy because we just don't learn that kind of stuff in school. So people do gravitate candidates because they saw an ad. It happens.
Yeah.
Especially like the local news stuff. So I think Sanders has a certain engaged base that's going to stick by him. But I do think that Bloomberg will definitely be able to take a certain chunk of the Democratic electorate for sure. And that is what, that will definitely damage Bloomberg, I think, or damage Sanders. I think Bloomberg will probably perform better than Biden in a lot of states once they both start competing because he's bought support. So like,
there's a reason he's doing all of this when he hasn't even participated in 3 races so far.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I think it's silly to discount him, and he's definitely presents a major threat. And he's like openly talking about how he's aiming for a brokered convention. He's openly talking about it. And when you have a brokered convention, like I'm pretty sure you can give your delegates to people. Like you can give your delegates to another candidate, if I'm not mistaken. So like, I imagine a scenario where they pool their delegates against Sanders. They pick a consensus candidate and pool their delegates against Sanders. That's why there's so many people in the race, because one person can't defeat Bernie Sanders, but 6 people can, you know? So if Bernie Sanders, maybe he won 46% in Nevada, but the other 54% went to all these different candidates who could then pool their support if they do decide to do that for a brokered convention. So yeah, I agree with 100% with what you said. I don't think people should discount Bloomberg. And I think sometimes people in media circles and activist circles overestimate how engaged the average voter is. They're just not as engaged as we are. They have lives, like they have full-time jobs, they have kids to take care of. And so like, I just know from my own relatives that that's the case. My immediate family has certain opinions because I like, force feed them information, but like, I can't do that for everyone I know. So yeah, I think it's definitely, Bloomberg presents the greatest threat to Sanders. And I don't think we've even seen the extent of it yet.
No, I think people have a tendency to kind of live in a bubble, especially on social media. But none of this is to attack Sanders supporters or even Sanders himself. It's to say that we actually need to have an honest conversation about what's going on right now before our very eyes, where they've already essentially taken elections from him, undermined his wins. It's happening now. It's only going to get worse. And if we don't talk about it now, we don't point it out now, and we don't have a candid conversation about what could happen at the convention, when all of that does roll around and they do take it from him, people will not be prepared to confront the media narrative or to confront the party. And so I just think it's worth raising these points. And I don't think it's going to hurt Sanders to raise these points. I think it'll only help him, especially if he himself could start communicating this to the public.
I agree 100%. That's exactly what his campaign needs to start doing. And for his supporters who are watching, like, yeah, I do want to emphasize, if you see how we tweet, we're total supportors. I want Sanders to be the nominee. I just want
Ryan's even working on behalf of Putin to
yeah.
get elected.
Yeah, I'm even working on behalf of a whole government. They've sent me. That would be really sad if a government invested in me to do anything like that. But no, I mean, I really do. For my own personal benefit, for the benefit of my own family.
All of us have student loans.
Yeah, all of us have student loans. All of us have issues with paying. All of us don't want to pay skyrocketing health insurance costs. All of us want to be able to have futures where we're not in debt. We all want, we want Bernie Sanders to be president. And so that's why I feel so strongly about these issues, because I feel like I'm watching all these things happen and I'm like, you guys, you got to see this. You have to see this bigger picture and we have to have a conversation about it. So I'm glad that we could do it here.
Me too, Rania. And I know we'll keep discussing offline, but maybe we'll have some more of these conversations in the future, because I think other people are thinking like us too. I believe that. So keep up the great work at Soapbox. We'll all keep watching you there, and I will talk to you very soon, I'm sure, Rania.
Thanks for having me on, Anya.